Welcome back to Gravepath Stories. Tonight, I have 10 true terrifying motel check in horror stories for you. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed. Because once you step onto the grave path, you don't walk alone. I was still rubbing stiffness out of my fingers from the drive when the desk clerk slid the key across the counter. And the moment I picked it up, I felt it. Heat, faint but unmistakable, like it had been resting in someone else's palm just seconds before mine. I remember pausing with the key pinched between my thumb and forefinger, looking at him, waiting for an explanation he didn't offer. He just smiled, thin and practiced, and said, "Room's ready." I laughed it off, told myself metal warms fast, but even as I turned away, something in my stomach tightened, the way it does when a detail refuses to fit. I unlocked the door and stepped inside without turning on the light, because that was my habit after long drives, letting my eyes adjust. The door closed behind me with a soft click that sounded final, heavier than it should have. I dropped my bag on the bed and held the key again, testing it. Still warm. I told myself the clerk probably held it too long. Maybe nervous, maybe bored. Crescent Junction wasn't exactly busy. I'd stayed in worse places. I shook my head, unpacked my notebook and the folder of inventory sheets I needed to review, and sat on the edge of the bed, trying to slide back into work mode. About an hour later, when I went to hang my jacket, I noticed the closet door didn't open all the way. It caught on something solid. I pushed harder, expecting a stuck hinge, and felt resistance like a body leaning back. My breath hitched before my brain caught up. I pulled the door open just enough to see a metal shelving unit bolted into the wall, dusty and bare, except for a laminated sheet taped to the top. It listed serial numbers for appliances that weren't in the room. Refrigerator, television, lamp. Each line had a check mark dated earlier that week. I stood there longer than necessary, trying to remember if inventory was sometimes stored in closets during renovations. The explanation felt thin, but I copied the numbers into my notebook anyway. That was my job. I went back to the desk later to ask for a receipt copy, and while the clerk printed it, I noticed a binder behind him, thick and worn, labeled maintenance records. It was open just a little, and I caught the word sealed stamped in red across a page. I asked about it casually, nodding toward the binder, and his hand moved so fast it startled me. He shut it, said those were old forms, nothing I needed to worry about. His voice didn't quite match his face. I thanked him and went back to my room with the receipt folded too many times in my pocket. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time I started to drift, I felt that warmth again, imagined another hand on the key, another presence moving just ahead of me. Sometime after midnight, I heard a soft scraping sound from inside the wall, not scratching, more like something being dragged carefully. I sat up, heart racing, listening. It stopped when I held my breath and started again when I exhaled. I pressed my ear to the wall and felt a faint vibration, rhythmic, deliberate. I told myself it was pipes, old building settling, but my mind kept going back to the closet, to the shelving bolted in like it was meant to hold weight. The next morning, I asked for coffee at the desk and struck up conversation, pushing gently, asking how long he'd worked there, whether there had been any renovations recently. He answered in short phrases, eyes flicking toward the hallway. When I mentioned I was doing inventory audits for regional motels, his shoulders stiffened. He said the owner handled that. I smiled, said I'd already started, just routine. He didn't smile back. After breakfast, I asked to see the maintenance records, citing corporate policy. He hesitated, then slid the binder across the counter without meeting my eyes. The pages smelled faintly metallic, like old blood or rust. I flipped through until I found the sealed stamp again. Room numbers jumped out at me, my pulse quickening. My room was listed. Sealed for safety pending investigation. Reason violent incident involving guest. Date 3 days before my arrival. My mouth went dry. I looked up, but the clerk had stepped away, pretending to fix something behind the counter. I copied everything quickly, hands shaking, and returned to my room. I locked the door and sat on the bed, staring at the notes. Violent incident. Sealed room. Yet here I was. I checked the door frame and noticed fresh paint around the latch, slightly tacky. The seal had been broken recently. I thought about leaving then, but a stubborn part of me, the part that kept me on the road for years, needed to understand. I needed a complete report. I searched the room more thoroughly this time. Behind the nightstand, I found a vent cover loose. Inside, there was a narrow crawl space, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. I felt sick imagining someone moving there, listening. I shined my flashlight and saw dark smears along the concrete. I didn't touch them. I backed away slowly, my skin buzzing. At the desk, I confronted the clerk, told him I'd seen the records. He sighed, the fight draining out of him, and said the owner insisted on reopening. Said the room had to make money. He admitted someone had died, a drifter, found too late. The investigation was ongoing. He said he'd warned the owner it was wrong. I asked who'd been in the room before me. He looked at the floor and said no one officially. I packed my bag and asked for a refund. He processed it without argument, hands trembling. Before I left, he said, almost to himself, that sometimes guests checked in who weren't on the logs. That sometimes keys got warm on their own. I didn't respond. I drove away without looking back. Later, I filed my report, flagged the motel, followed up with authorities. The room was shut down again, permanently this time. Months passed. I tried to forget the warmth of the key, the feeling of being just behind someone else's footsteps. But every so often, when I unlock a door, I pause, waiting to feel heat, to know whether I'm alone or stepping into something that hasn't finished yet. I was carrying our last suitcase down the narrow outdoor walkway when my son tugged on my sleeve and said, very casually, "Why is Daniel working the desk so late?" I stopped walking mid-step, the bag scraping against my leg, because the name hit me wrong. Not scary wrong. Familiar wrong. The kind of wrong that makes your stomach tighten before your brain can explain why. I looked back toward the office window, where the night clerk sat behind the counter, head down, writing in a ledger. He was an older man, grey hair, glasses slipping down his nose. I had spoken to him not 10 minutes earlier, and I was certain he never said his name. There was no name tag, no sign. Nothing. I asked my son what he meant, and he shrugged like it was obvious. "Daniel," he said again. He said hi to me. We had been on the road all day. My wife driving while I handled maps and snacks. Our son flipping through a dinosaur book in the back seat. Drummond County roads, are long and empty, in a way that makes you feel watched by the land itself. And by the time we pulled into the motel, I was tired enough to miss small details. The kind of tired that makes you trust routines. Check in, unload, sleep, leave. I told myself that kids say things. That he probably heard the name somewhere and stitched it into the moment. Still, I turned and looked back at the office again, watching the clerk's reflection in the glass. He didn't look up. He didn't react. Just kept writing. Inside the room, I set the suitcase down harder than I meant to. My wife asked what was wrong, and I told her what our son said. She smiled at him and asked if the man told him his name. Our son shook his head. "He didn't tell me," he said. "He just knows I know." That answer bothered me more than the name itself. Kids misshare things all the time, but that wasn't missharing. That was confidence. The kind you get when something feels obvious. I knelt in front of him and asked when the clerk talked to him. He said it was when I was signing the card and my wife was digging for change. I remembered that moment. I remembered my son standing right beside me. Silent, fingers on the counter. I did not remember the clerk speaking to him at all. While my wife unpacked, I checked the windows and door, more out of habit than fear. The room was clean but old, with furniture that had been moved and repaired too many times. As I opened the dresser drawers, my son sat cross-legged on the bed, flipping his book shut. "Daniel used to have one of these," he said, tapping the cover. I asked what he meant, and he frowned like I was being slow. "The bones," he said. He liked the big ones. My wife shot me a look over her shoulder. The playful smile was gone now. She asked our son who Daniel was. He looked confused. "He's Daniel?" he said. "He stays here." We exchanged the kind of glance married people share when they are trying not to alarm a child. My wife suggested maybe our son was thinking about someone from school. He shook his head again. "No," he said. "He's from here. He's in the book." That was when the first real chill settled in. Because we had not opened any other books yet. We had not unpacked anything except clothes. There was no motel brochure in the room. No local history pamphlet. The only book out was the dinosaur one he had brought from home. I stepped into the bathroom to splash water on my face, telling myself to reset. When I came back out, my wife was sitting on the edge of the bed, her voice low. Our son was pointing at the bedside table drawer, which she had just opened. Inside were two books. One was a worn Gideon Bible. The other was a thick, hand-bound ledger, its cover faded and cracked. Neither of us had put it there. My wife said it must have been left by mistake, but her tone didn't convince either of us. I picked it up. The pages were yellowed, the ink uneven. Names filled each line, written in different hands, spanning years. Guest names, dates, room numbers. My son leaned close. "See," he said, pointing at a name near the middle of a page. "Daniel." The last name was smudged, hard to read, but the first name was clear. Next to it was a date from years earlier, and the same room number we were in now. I asked him how he knew which one to look at. He said he just knew. That Daniel didn't leave. My wife closed the drawer and told him to go wash his hands. When he was gone, she whispered that maybe this was some kind of guest book, something quirky. I nodded, but my eyes kept going back to the name. I took the ledger down to the office, under the excuse of asking for extra towels. The clerk looked up as I approached, his eyes tired but sharp. I asked him about the book, holding it out. His expression tightened in a way that felt practiced. He said it wasn't supposed to be in the room, that it was old, that he would take it back. I asked him if his name was Daniel. He paused just long enough for the question to land. Then he shook his head. No, he said. Never has been. I asked if he knew someone named Daniel who worked here. He told me no again, more firmly. I asked him about the name in the ledger. He reached for the book, and I pulled it back, just a little. He sighed and said Daniel was a guest. A long time ago. A boy. He said the family made a fuss, accused the motel of things that weren't true. Then they left. I asked him what things. He told me it was late, and I should go back to my room. The towels were already on the counter. I took them, feeling the weight of the ledger in my hand, then handed it over. As I turned to leave, he said quietly, "Your son shouldn't read old things." I asked how he knew it was my son. He didn't answer. Back in the room, my wife wanted to leave. She said she didn't care about the money. Our son was unusually quiet now. Sitting on the bed, watching the door, I asked him what Daniel told him. He said Daniel didn't talk with his mouth. He said Daniel said his parents were mad because they forgot him, that they drove away. I felt my chest tighten. I asked him how old Daniel was. He held up 5 fingers. Then he paused and folded one down. 4, he said. That number mattered because our son was 4. I stepped outside to call the local police station, unsure what I was even going to say. While the phone rang, I noticed something I had missed earlier. A small plaque near the office door, half hidden by a vending machine. It listed the motel's opening year and, beneath it, a line that said renovated after incident. No date. Just that. The dispatcher answered, and I told her I had questions about a missing child case connected to the motel. There was a pause. She asked me how I knew about that. I told her about the ledger. She told me to stay where I was. She said an officer would come by. When I went back inside, my wife was packing. Our son asked if Daniel was in trouble. I told him no. I told him we were just going to talk to some people. He asked if Daniel could come with us. I said no again, more sharply than I meant to. He flinched. Then he said something that still wakes me up at night. He said, "He can't. He's stuck in the book." The officer arrived within 20 minutes. A woman, calm, professional. She asked to see the ledger. The clerk tried to say it was private property. She shut that down quickly. We all sat in the office while she flipped through the pages. When she reached the name Daniel, she stopped. She asked the clerk questions. He answered with increasing agitation. Eventually, he admitted that a family had stayed there years ago, that their son wandered off during unpacking, that there was confusion about which room they were in, that by the time anyone noticed, the boy was gone. The parents accused the motel of negligence. The case went nowhere, no body, no answers. I asked why the ledger was still there. He said it was tradition, a way of remembering guests. The officer asked why Daniel's name never had a checkout date. He didn't answer that. She told us the case was still technically open. She asked my son if Daniel talked to him. He nodded. She asked what he said. My son said he wanted his mom and dad to come back, that he didn't want to be forgotten again. We left that night. The officer escorted us to our car. As we pulled away, I looked back at the office. The clerk was standing in the doorway, watching us go. I don't know what happened after that. I know the motel closed within the year. I know the case was reopened, though nothing new was ever found. My son doesn't talk about Daniel anymore. When I asked him once, he said Daniel was sleeping now, that someone remembered him properly. I don't know if that's true. I just know I will never forget the sound of my child saying a stranger's name like it belonged in our family. I was already kneeling on the bathroom tile with my camera in my hand when I noticed the mirror wasn't where it should have been. I had pushed the door closed with my heel to block the hallway noise, and when it swung back a few inches, something caught the corner of my eye. There was a second reflection, not of me, not of the sink, but of the room behind me at a wrong angle, like the space had folded without permission. I froze there, one knee aching against the floor, breath shallow, listening for movement. I told myself it was fatigue. I had been on the road all day, driving from one forgotten scene to another, documenting vandalized properties for an insurance review tied to an old homicide. I stood slowly and opened the door again. The normal mirror above the sink reflected my face, pale, eyes too alert. But behind the door, mounted flush and hidden, was another mirror, tall and narrow, its edges dulled with age. I touched the glass with my fingertips. Cold, solid, real. My reflection appeared, but not exactly. In the hidden mirror, my shoulder sat lower than it should have. My hair fell differently. And behind me the bed was closer, the lamp slightly off. The room looked like mine, but wrong in small, undeniable ways that made my stomach tighten. I stepped back into the bedroom and turned around, comparing the space to what I had just seen. The lamp was farther from the bed than the mirror suggested. The dresser had a nick in the corner that didn't exist in the reflection. I felt a familiar professional instinct kick in, the same one that had kept me calm at scenes where blood soaked into carpet and families watched from doorways. I lifted my camera and took a photograph of the hidden mirror. The shutter sounded too loud. I waited, counting my breaths, listening for footsteps outside, for a knock, for someone to tell me I was somewhere I shouldn't be. Nothing happened. I leaned closer to the mirror and realized the angle wasn't reflecting my room at all. It was showing the room next door. The realization settled slowly, like ice sinking through water. I could see a nightstand that wasn't mine, a suitcase with a cracked handle, a man's jacket draped over a chair. The image shifted slightly, not with my movement, but with something else. Someone else. A figure crossed the reflection, not visible in my room, but clear in the glass. A man paused, rubbed his face, and sat on the bed I was not standing beside. I stepped back as if burned. My heart hammered hard enough to make my vision pulse. I thought about knocking, about calling the front desk, about pretending I had seen nothing. Instead, I checked the time on my watch and remembered why I was here. The motel had been listed in an old report tied to a murder that never saw trial. The victim had been a young woman found miles away. Her last known location, a room paid for in cash under a false name. My job was to document structural damage for a delayed civil claim. No one mentioned surveillance. I sat on my bed and stared at the bathroom door. Every instinct told me to leave, but another part of me, The part that catalogued details because they mattered later knew I couldn't. I stood, locked my door, and returned to the bathroom. The man next door was gone now. The bed was empty, the jacket still draped. I photographed the mirror again, adjusting focus, capturing the room beyond with clinical precision. There was a soft knock, not on my door, but through the wall, a dull sound like knuckles on plaster. I jumped despite myself. The knock came again, closer, deliberate. I whispered hello without thinking. The sound stopped. My pulse thundered in my ears. I pressed my ear to the wall and heard breathing on the other side, slow and controlled. I backed away and sat on the edge of my bed, camera clutched to my chest. I told myself this could be illegal, but not supernatural, invasive but explainable. Two-way mirrors existed. People used them. Monsters didn't need to. I reached for the phone and called the front desk. The line rang longer than it should have before a man answered with a flat hello. I asked about the mirror. There was a pause so long I thought the call had dropped. Then he said there was only one mirror in each room and suggested I get some rest. His voice held no curiosity, no concern. I told him I was a crime scene photographer working on a case connected to the property. Another pause. He asked which case. I said the woman found near the plateau years ago. He hung up. That was when the doorknob rattled. Once. Twice. I stood, heart racing, and whispered that the room was occupied. A man's voice answered through the door, calm, almost polite, saying he just wanted to talk. I recognized it from the breathing through the wall. I grabbed my camera bag and moved toward the window, only to remember I was on the second floor with no easy exit. The knocking stopped. Silence pressed in, thick and heavy. I waited, muscles aching, until my legs trembled. When nothing happened, I returned to the bathroom, driven by a need to understand. The mirror showed the adjacent room again. The man stood there now, looking directly at the glass at me. Our eyes met through the wrong reflection. He smiled like we shared a secret. He raised his hand and knocked, and I felt it through the wall behind me. I backed away, shaking, and suddenly understood. The mirror wasn't just for watching. It was for choosing. I thought of the murdered woman, of how she might have stood in this same spot, unaware. I lifted my camera and photographed him, capturing his face through the mirror. His smile vanished. He turned and left the reflected room in a rush. I heard footsteps in the hallway, doors opening and closing. I didn't wait. I unlocked my door and ran, camera banging against my side, down the stairs and into the night. I drove until my hands stopped shaking and went straight to the county office in the morning. I turned over everything, the photographs, the room number, the conversation, the hidden mirror. The investigation that followed uncovered a network of illegal surveillance tied to blackmail and at least one murder. The man from the mirror was arrested. The motel was shut down. The mirror was removed. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I still think about how close I came to staying quiet, how easily it could have ended differently. I tell you this because it was real, because I was there, and because some places don't just watch you. They wait to see if you notice. I was already reaching for the door when the knocking started, hard enough to rattle the thin wood, and sharp enough to make my hand freeze on the handle. I remember thinking it was too late for anyone to be polite about it, too deliberate to be accidental. I stood there listening, heart ticking faster than the cheap wall clock behind me, telling myself it was probably another driver who'd gotten the wrong room. When I didn't answer, the knocking stopped, and that silence felt worse than the sound. I opened the door a crack. The hallway was empty. No footsteps moving away, no voices, no shadows sliding back into rooms. Just the carpet, worn thin in a straight line from years of boots and luggage wheels, and the faint smell of disinfectant that never quite masked something sour underneath. I closed the door and locked it, leaning my weight against it for a second, like that might help. That was when I noticed the time on my logbook. According to my handwritten notes, I had checked in at 11:45. According to the receipt folded in my pocket, the clerk had stamped it just after midnight. That shouldn't have mattered, but it did. It mattered because of the way he'd looked at me when I slid the cash across the counter. He hadn't smiled. He hadn't even glanced at the money. He just said, very calmly, "No refunds after midnight," and pushed the key toward me like he was done with the conversation before it even started. I picked up the logbook from the small table and flipped through the pages, checking my own writing like I didn't trust myself anymore. The times were neat, careful, exactly how I always kept them. I'd been driving too long to be sloppy. I knew how important rest hours were, how quickly a mistake could cost you your license or worse. I hadn't been tired when I pulled in, just worn down, ready to stop moving for a few hours. That was all. Another knock at the door, slower this time. 3 taps, evenly spaced. I didn't answer. I sat on the edge of the bed instead, the mattress sagging under my weight, listening to my own breathing. My phone had no signal. That wasn't unusual out there, but it still made me feel cut off, like the world had shrunk down to that room and the narrow hallway outside it. The knock came again, then a voice. A man's voice, low and strained, asking if I had the time. I swallowed and said nothing. I don't know why I didn't answer. Maybe it was the way he asked, like he already knew I was awake, like he was humoring me by pretending there was a choice. When he stopped talking, I waited for footsteps. There were none. I decided to leave. I didn't care about the money anymore. I just wanted to be back in my cab, doors locked, engine humming, moving forward like I was supposed to. I grabbed my jacket, stuffed the logbook into my bag, and unlocked the door. The hallway was still empty, but something about it felt tighter, like the walls had edged closer when I wasn't looking. The exit sign glowed at the far end. I walked toward it, my boots sounding too loud against the carpet. When I reached the door and pushed, it didn't budge. I pushed harder, then tried the handle. Locked. I stared at it for a second, then laughed under my breath, telling myself it was nothing, probably secured overnight. I turned back toward the desk. The lobby lights were dimmer than before. The clerk was still there, sitting exactly how I'd left him, hands folded on the counter. When I told him I needed to leave, he shook his head slowly. After midnight, he said, no refunds. I told him I didn't care about a refund. He looked at me like I'd missed the point entirely. He slid a ledger toward me, open to a page filled with names and times. He told me I needed to log my rest properly. Rules were rules. If the book wasn't right, it caused problems. I glanced down at the page and felt my stomach drop. My name was already there. written in ink darker than the rest, with a checkout time listed hours in the future. I told him that wasn't possible. He shrugged and said the book didn't lie. That was when I heard the knocking again, not at the front door, but somewhere behind the walls. It moved, traveling slowly, like someone testing each room from the inside. The clerk didn't react. He just watched me, eyes dull, waiting. I backed away from the counter and headed down another corridor, trying doors as I went. Every one of them was locked. The knocking followed me, always just out of sight, always the same steady rhythm. I started to sweat, my shirt sticking to my back, my thoughts tripping over each other. I kept telling myself there had to be another exit, a fire door, something. I found it at the end of the hall, marked clearly. I shoved it open and stepped into a narrow space that smelled like dust and old oil. The door slammed shut behind me before I could turn. I pounded on it, shouting, my voice echoing back at me, thin and useless. When I tried to open it again, it wouldn't move. The knocking stopped. I don't know how long I stood there before the clerk's voice came through the door, calm as ever. He told me to get some rest. He said I was logged until morning. He said this had happened before, and it always worked out better when people followed the schedule. Something inside me broke then. I slid down the wall and laughed, a harsh sound that scraped my throat raw. I thought about the ledger, about the names I'd seen, how many of them didn't have checkout times at all. I thought about the man knocking on my door, asking for the time, and wondered if he'd ever gotten an answer. Eventually, exhaustion took over. I don't remember falling asleep, just waking up on the floor of my room, the door unlocked, the sun creeping through the thin curtains. My truck was still there. The exit door opened without a fight. The clerk was gone. In my logbook, the times were wrong, all of them. Hours missing, others doubled. Enough to end my career if anyone looked too closely. I fixed what I could and drove away, hands shaking on the wheel. I never went back. But sometimes, when I stop too late and the road is empty, I think about that sign over the desk and the way the clerk said it like a promise. No refunds after midnight, and I keep driving until morning. I was still holding my clipboard when the desk clerk slid the key across the counter and said, "You're in 14?" I didn't respond right away because I was rereading the address on my intake notes, making sure I hadn't driven to the wrong place. When I looked up, he was already turning away, like the transaction had ended, whether I was ready or not. I took the key, thanked him out of habit, and walked toward the stairs, telling myself to stay focused. I was here to check on a family, not to overthink a cheap motel stop. The door stuck when I pushed it open, and I had to lean my shoulder into it. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and something sweeter underneath, like baby powder. That made me pause, but what actually stopped me was the crib. It was set up against the far wall, sheets tucked tight, mattress clean, mobile hanging above it with little fabric moons. I stood there with my bag sliding off my shoulder, my brain lagging behind my eyes. I remember saying out loud, "No," like that could undo it. I dropped my bag and walked closer, touching the rail with one finger, solid. Real. No dust. The sheets were warm, not body warm, but like the room had been used recently. I checked the bathroom, the closet, under the bed, because my instincts were screaming that someone might still be here. The room was otherwise standard. 2 beds, nightstand, television. Nothing else out of place. Just the crib, like it belonged there. I went back downstairs and asked the clerk about it. I kept my voice calm, professional, the way I do when parents get defensive. He didn't even blink before saying, "We don't have cribs." I told him there was one in my room. He shook his head and said housekeeping must have messed up. I asked him to come see it. He said he was alone on shift and couldn't leave the desk. When I asked where housekeeping stored extra furniture, he said they didn't. His answers were too quick, too smooth. And I felt that familiar tightening in my chest that usually means I'm being lied to. I went back to the room and locked the door behind me, though I wasn't sure why. I took pictures on my phone, making sure to get the room number in the frame. I checked my assignment again. Welfare visit scheduled for the next morning. Infant reported present. No prior removals. That detail made my stomach drop. I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to breathe through it, reminding myself that coincidences happen. But this didn't feel like one. I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined hearing a baby cry, even though the room was silent. I kept staring at the crib, half expecting it to be gone when I looked back. It stayed. When morning came, I left early, telling myself I'd deal with the motel later. The job came first. The family lived a few miles away in a rental that smelled like old smoke and damp carpet. The mother answered the door holding a bottle, no baby in sight. She looked tired, not nervous, which mattered to me. We talked. I asked routine questions. I listened. When I finally asked to see the baby, her face went still. She said the baby was staying with a cousin for a few days. She gave me a name and an address without hesitation, which should have reassured me, but didn't. When I left, I didn't go back to the motel. I drove to the cousin's address. It didn't exist. I called the number the mother gave me. Disconnected. I sat in my car gripping the steering wheel, feeling that slow burn of dread that comes when something shifts from concerning to wrong. I called my supervisor and explained what I had. She told me to document everything and loop in law enforcement. I did. But I didn't mention the crib. I couldn't explain why. It felt too strange, too easily dismissed. That night, back at the motel, the crib was gone. The room looked untouched, like it had never been there. I checked my photos again, relief and fear tangling when I saw proof that I hadn't imagined it. I went to the desk. A different clerk this time. I asked about housekeeping. She told me they hadn't been in my room. When I mentioned the crib, her eyes flicked to the hallway before she said, "I don't know what you're talking about." I knew then that whatever was happening, the motel was part of it. Over the next few days, the case escalated fast. The baby was officially missing. The mother stopped answering calls. Police interviews went nowhere. I kept thinking about the motel, about how the crib had been ready, like someone was expecting a transfer. That word stuck with me. Transfer. Not adoption. Not care. Movement. I started looking at my past cases, focusing on families placed in temporary housing. Patterns emerged that made my hands shake. Motels, short stays, infants listed, then gone. I took my findings to a detective who actually listened. He asked me to show him the motel. We went together, unannounced. The manager tried to block us from certain rooms. That alone was enough. in a storage space behind the laundry. They found disassembled cribs stacked neatly, each tagged with a room number. Ledgers listed check-in times that matched reported welfare visits. Checkout times were missing. Transfers weren't. The investigation broke wide after that. The motel was a node. Not the whole operation, but a clean, forgettable place where babies could be moved without raising alarms. Staff were paid to deny, redirect, forget. Families were coerced or paid. Some didn't know where their children went. Others did and stayed silent. The baby from my case was found alive weeks later, across state lines. I held her once, briefly, while a nurse adjusted a monitor. She was small, but she breathed, and that mattered more than anything. The mother was arrested. She cried when they took her away. I don't know if it was guilt or fear. I testified. I documented. I burned out faster than I expected. I left the job not long after, telling people I needed a change. The truth is, I couldn't walk into another motel without my chest tightening. I couldn't see a crib without feeling that first moment all over again, standing frozen in that room, realizing something terrible was hiding in plain sight. The motel shut down. New paint, new sign, different name. People drive past it now, without knowing what passed through those rooms, I know. And I keep telling this story because silence is how it worked for so long, and I won't be part of that anymore. I was halfway down the corridor with Mrs. Hensley's arm locked in mine when the fire alarm cut out. Not faded, not slowed, just stopped, and the sudden silence made my ears ring. She tightened her grip and asked me if that meant we were safe now. I remember answering too quickly, saying yes, because the word felt like something solid I could hand her. The motel manager had told us to use the emergency exits immediately. No elevators, no delays. So I kept moving, guiding her walker with my foot, smelling smoke that wasn't quite inside yet, but close enough to make every breath feel borrowed. We reached the red door at the end of the hall, the one with the glowing running man's sign above it. I pushed it open and felt relief for exactly 1 second. The relief vanished when the door closed behind us, and we were standing in another hallway, carpeted the same, walls the same color, the same ugly landscape print crooked near the ice machine. I stopped walking. Mrs. Hensley bumped into my back and apologized. I told her it was fine, even though my heart had already started to thud in a way that felt wrong. I told myself it was a service corridor, maybe a loop, maybe I'd just taken a wrong turn. Smoke seeped under a door somewhere behind us. I heard coughing. I took Mrs. Hensley forward again, faster now, until we reached another exit door. I pushed that one too. Same thing. Another hallway. Same carpet stain shaped like Australia. Same print, same ice machine hum. That was the moment I felt fear settle properly, not sharp, not panicked. Just heavy and deliberate, like something sitting down inside my chest. I turned us around and headed back, thinking I could retrace our steps, but every turn looked identical. Doors were numbered, but the numbers made no sense. They jumped backward. 12 beside 27. 8 beside 40. Mrs. Hensley asked if the building was bigger than it looked. I didn't answer her right away. I was trying to remember how many floors this place even had. I had checked in less than an hour earlier, evacuated from the highway with everyone else. Grateful for a bed, not thinking beyond that. A man came out of one of the rooms, barefoot, holding a damp towel over his mouth. He asked me where the exit was. I told him I was trying to find it. He stared at me like I had said something deeply stupid, then tried the door behind him. It didn't open. He tried the handle harder, then kicked it once, swore, and ran down the hall past us, coughing. Mrs. Hensley's breathing changed. I felt it through her arm. I told her we were going to sit down for a second. I parked her walker by the wall and lowered her onto the carpet. She asked about her husband, whether he had made it out. I didn't know who her husband was. I told her I would go find someone who knew. I left her there, against every instinct I had, because staying felt worse. I jogged down the corridor until my lungs burned, opening doors marked exit, stairwell, service, all of them feeding me back into the same looping interior. The fire alarm started again, then stopped again. Somewhere glass shattered. Someone screamed once and then cut off. When I finally found the front desk again, I knew it because of the smell of coffee and the chipped counter. I almost cried. The manager was there, calm in a way that felt rehearsed, phone pressed to his ear. I told him the exits looped. I told him elderly guests were stuck. He nodded without surprise and said emergency services were delayed, that the fire line had shifted. He told me to keep guests calm and wait. I asked him why the exits didn't work. He said something about renovations, about temporary rerouting. I asked why there were no signs. He put his hand over the receiver and told me, quietly, that panic would make things worse. I ran back for Mrs. Hensley. She was still sitting there, eyes closed, lips moving like she was counting. I lifted her again, apologizing, promising I wouldn't leave this time. We passed other guests now, herded together, some crying, some angry, all of us moving in circles. Smoke was thicker. My throat hurt. I started opening random doors, ignoring signs, trusting nothing. One door led into a narrow stairwell. I pushed Mrs. Hensley inside and felt a rush of hope that almost made me laugh. We went down one flight. The door at the bottom opened into another hallway. That was when a woman grabbed my arm and said she had worked insurance claims for 20 years, and nothing about this building made sense. She pointed out the reinforced doors, the way the exits were designed to keep people inside. She said fires like this paid well, if the loss was total. I didn't want to believe her. I wanted an explanation that didn't involve intent. But when the manager appeared at the end of the hall, blocking our path, telling us to remain where we were, something in his eyes confirmed it. Not panic, calculation. I yelled. Others joined in. Someone threw a chair. Smoke alarms screamed continuously now. The woman from insurance found a service door behind a linen cart and forced it open with a fire extinguisher. Heat hit us like a wall, but beyond it was outside. Real outside. Sky choked with smoke but open. I got Mrs. Hensley through. Others followed. Someone pulled me back when I stumbled. We ran until the ground was dirt and not carpet. Later, after the fire, after the investigation, after the arrests, I learned the motel had been designed to delay evacuation, not prevent it, just slow it enough. The manager had been promised a payout that night. He hadn't planned on guests helping each other. Mrs. Hensley survived. Her husband had made it out another way. When I think about that hallway now, how it kept folding in on itself, I don't think about ghosts or curses. I think about how easily safety signs can lie, and how close we came to trusting them to the end. I was already counting heads when the clerk looked up from the computer and said my name like he knew me, slow and careful. Then added that the boy was already registered. I remember freezing with the clipboard pressed against my chest, the line of children behind me restless, bags scraping the floor. I asked him to repeat himself, thinking I had misunderstood his accent or the noise. He smiled politely and tapped the screen, saying the child had checked in earlier, same school group, same spelling, same birthday. I laughed because that felt easier than arguing. Told him there must be a mistake, that we had just arrived together. He shook his head and turned the monitor slightly. I could see a name highlighted. Our student's name, and next to it a room number already assigned. My stomach tightened. I told him to clear it, to start over. He said he could not without authorization. Behind me, the children started whispering, sensing something off, the way kids always do before adults admit it. I turned and scanned their faces automatically, counting again, one by one. Everyone was there. The boy in question stood near the end, hugging his backpack, looking confused but calm. I asked him if he had come inside earlier with anyone, maybe to use the restroom. He shook his head. I asked if he knew this place. He said no. His voice was steady. That unsettled me more than fear would have. I told him to stay close and went back to the desk. The clerk asked for my passport while explaining that the system logs entries automatically. He said the registration time showed earlier that afternoon, long before our bus arrived. I felt heat crawl up my neck. I told him to cancel it, that I was responsible for these children. He sighed and picked up a phone, speaking quietly to someone in the back office. I heard him repeat the boy's name again, slower this time, as if testing how it sounded aloud. While he was on the phone, I looked back at the children. The boy met my eyes and shrugged, embarrassed. I tried to reassure him with a smile that probably looked stiff. I remembered his paperwork, his emergency contact forms, the way his handwriting leaned slightly to the left. Everything about him was ordinary. That ordinariness felt important. I told myself computers make mistakes. Still, my fingers dug into the clipboard hard enough to hurt. The clerk hung up and said his manager wanted to check the archive. He asked me to take the children to the seating area. I gathered them, gave instructions, tried to sound normal. I told the boy to sit beside me. He did, swinging his legs. I asked him again if he had ever been here before. He shook his head and asked if he was in trouble. I said no too quickly. He frowned at that, then looked away. Minutes stretched. The lobby felt too small. I watched the door to the back office, rehearsing what I would say to parents if this delayed us. I was responsible for supervising students, for keeping things orderly. That role anchored me. When the clerk returned, he held a thin folder. He said the archive entry matched exactly, including a scanned identification photo. He asked if the boy had ever lost documents. I felt my mouth go dry. I asked to see the photo. He hesitated, then turned the folder around. The image was old, grainy, printed on yellowing paper, but the face was unmistakable. Same eyes, same small scar near the eyebrow I had noticed during enrollment. The hair was cut differently, the clothes outdated, but it was him. My chest tightened so hard I had to breathe through my nose. I heard myself ask when the photo was taken. The clerk said the file dated back decades. He said the system flagged it as unresolved. A missing child report attached to a guest record that was never closed. I felt dizzy. I asked him to explain that sentence again. He did slower. A child with that name and description had gone missing after staying here long ago. The case remained open. The room number in the archive matched the one assigned earlier today. I stood up so fast the chair scraped loudly. The children looked at me. I told them to stay seated and walk back to the desk. I asked if anyone else had access to that room. The clerk said no. Not since the disappearance. He said it had been kept, locked out of respect. That assigning it today was an error caused by merging old records into a new system. He tried to sound reasonable. It did not work. I asked where the room was. He told me. I told him I needed to see it immediately. He hesitated again, then handed me a key, his hand trembling slightly. I told another teacher to watch the group. I told the boy to come with me. He asked why. I said because I needed him close. He nodded, trusting me in that way children do, and followed without complaint. That trust felt heavy. The hallway to the room felt longer than it should have. I counted doors, focused on the rhythm of our steps. When we stopped, the number on the door matched both records. I unlocked it and pushed inside. Nothing looked unusual at first glance. 2 beds, curtains drawn, air stale. I stepped carefully, scanning for anything that might explain the file. The boy stood near the door, eyes wide, silent. I told him not to touch anything. On the desk, there was a guest book beneath a layer of dust. I opened it. Names filled the early pages, then stopped abruptly decades ago. The last entry matched the name again, written in a child's careful script. My hands shook. I turned the page. Tucked inside was a photocopy of a missing child notice, creased from handling. The photo was the same as the archive. The age listed was younger, but the details matched. I felt something settle into place in my mind, a terrible logic. I asked the boy if he recognized the handwriting. He leaned closer, then nodded slowly. He said it looked like his, but older, like when he practiced at home. He asked me why his name was there. I had no answer that would not hurt him. I told him we were leaving. I took his hand, firm, and guided him out. Back in the lobby, the manager was waiting. She asked me to sit. I refused. I told her what I saw. She said the original disappearance had never been solved, that the child was presumed taken by someone who checked out alone. She said records were sealed. I asked why the room still existed. She said history has inertia. I told her I was calling the police. She did not stop me. That scared me most. While we waited, I kept the boy beside me. He asked if he was in danger. I told him no, then corrected myself and said I would not let anything happen to him. That felt more honest. When the officers arrived, they listened carefully, took notes, asked the boy gentle questions. He answered calmly, unaware of the weight of what he said. He said he had dreams of places he had never been. They showed him the old photo. He stared at it for a long time, then said it felt like remembering something he was not supposed to remember. The officers exchanged looks. They told me the case would be reopened. They said the coincidence was impossible to ignore. They asked if the boy had ever been reported missing before. I said no, his parents were attentive, his records complete. That made everything worse. The officers inspected the room again, this time thoroughly. They found a loose panel behind the wardrobe. Inside were small objects, toys, notes, Things a child might hide. One note mentioned a promise to come back. The handwriting matched. The boy watched from the doorway, quiet. I felt sick. The officers closed the panel and guided us away. They said the building would be sealed. The manager nodded, pale and resigned. We were relocated to another place that night. I stayed awake, listening to the children breathe, replaying every moment I had ever spent with the boy, searching for signs. There were none. In the morning, his parents arrived, frantic. I told them everything. They held him tightly, crying. He seemed confused, but unharmed. The police assured us he was safe. They said sometimes records surface at strange times. Months later, I was contacted again. The investigation uncovered evidence that the missing child from decades ago had been returned secretly, raised under the same name. The case buried through corruption and fear. The motel room was a fixed point in that cover-up, a place records could not escape. The boy would never remember what happened then. He would never need to. The case was closed properly this time. I still think about the way the clerk said the name, careful and certain, like the truth announcing itself before anyone was ready. I tell you this because it was real, because paperwork and systems carry ghosts more effectively than stories. I supervise students differently now. I check names twice. And whenever I hand over a passport, I remember that sometimes the past recognizes us before we recognize it. I was halfway down the hallway with my recorder in my pocket when the housekeeping cart rolled past the stairwell, metal rattling softly, wheels turning with purpose. And I froze because the desk clerk had sworn nobody worked nights here. Not since the accident they refused to explain clearly then. I stood there listening, heart thudding, telling myself it was stress, that I had driven too long for this assignment. But the cart stopped outside a room down the hall, and I heard a door unlock, followed by the sound of something heavy being dragged slowly across the floor inside. I waited until the hallway went quiet again, then crept back to my room, locking the door and pressing my ear against it, trying to convince myself that investigative reporting did not include chasing phantom janitors at midnight in a nearly empty roadside motel after a long, exhausting drive tonight. I was in Butte Valley to interview the owner about a suspicious death years earlier, a supposed slip in the laundry room. And every local I spoke to lowered their voice when mentioning the motel, as if the walls themselves still listened for mistakes nobody ever truly forgot here, locally. The next morning I asked the desk clerk again about overnight staff, and she laughed too quickly, saying the carts were locked, unused, and that I must have dreamed it, though she avoided eye contact and slid my receipt across the counter with shaking fingers, betraying practiced dishonesty today, alone. I spent the day digging through county records, old newspapers, and microfilm reels, finding a brief article about a female guest who died on site, ruled accidental, unnamed, described only as a drifter passing through, which immediately bothered me as lazy reporting from a paper that usually loved details then. That night I stayed awake, recorder on the table, lights off, listening, and just after midnight the wheels returned, closer this time, stopping outside my door, lingering, as if waiting for me to open it or breathe too loudly, while my pulse hammered painfully inside my ears, then again endlessly. I did not open the door, but I spoke through it, asking who was there, identifying myself, and the cart rolled away immediately, fast, not squeaking now, purposeful again, which told me something intelligent was responding to being noticed, and that realization terrified me more than ghosts ever could hear. The following morning, I demanded to see the owner, a man named Harold, who arrived smelling of bleach, smiling too much, insisting the motel had no secrets, no night staff, and no reason for a reporter to be snooping around private tragedies that had been resolved legally long ago, supposedly. I told him about the carts, the sounds, the unlocked doors, and he listened carefully, then suggested I might be confusing his motel with another property, offering coffee. Changing subjects, controlling the conversation with practiced calm that set my teeth on edge, because fear was clearly something he managed daily. I excused myself to the restroom, instead slipping down the service hallway I had noticed earlier, following scuffed floor marks, the same width as the cart wheels, leading toward the laundry room mentioned in the death article. My stomach tightening with every step and every unanswered question ahead of me. The laundry room door was locked, but a faint humming came from inside, steady and mechanical, and when I pressed my ear to it, I heard something slide, stop, and then the unmistakable clink of metal hitting tile, followed by a wet sound I could not place then there alone. I stepped back just as Harold appeared behind me, asking calmly what I was doing, and I lied, saying I was lost, while noticing a fresh scrape on his forearm, as if someone had grabbed him hard recently during a struggle that did not end well for them ever again. He told me the laundry room was unsafe, off limits, and guided me away, his hand firm on my elbow, steering me back toward the lobby, where he suddenly grew friendly again, asking about my drive, my career, my plans, as if rehearsing normalcy to hide something rotten beneath smiles. That afternoon, I met an older woman at a diner who recognized the motel name and warned me quietly that people checked in there and never checked out, that the accident was staged, and that carts were used to move bodies to vehicles before dawn without witnesses ever nearby watching. She said her cousin worked housekeeping years earlier, disappeared after threatening to talk, and that the owner paid off officials by claiming transients were dying accidentally. Something nobody bothered to question, because the victims had no families nearby to demand answers or file missing person reports later on officially anywhere. That night I packed quickly, planning to leave, but the cart came again, stopping outside my room, and this time the handle rattled, testing the lock, while a calm voice said housekeeping in a tone meant to reassure someone who had learned guests trusted routines blindly, without thought first always. I shouted that I was armed, lying, and the voice sighed, sounding disappointed. Then the cart rolled away slowly, deliberately, as if promising to return. And I knew leaving quietly would not be an option anymore without confronting what was happening inside this building that trapped others before me there. I grabbed my recorder and camera and went to the laundry room, forcing the door with a fire extinguisher, revealing blood stains, broken tiles, and a hidden ramp leading to a loading bay, where the cart tracks ended beside a drain, recently scrubbed far too clean for comfort tonight alone. Harold confronted me there, panicking now, confessing in fragments that accidents were arranged, that desperate people made easy victims, and that the motel survived by erasing guests who caused trouble. all while sirens approached outside, because I had already called authorities before breaking the door earlier alone inside here tonight. He was arrested that night, the motel shut down, bodies recovered, identities restored, and my story ran nationally. But I still wake sometimes hearing wheels in hallways, remembering how easily evil hid behind routine and polite smiles when nobody bothered to look too closely before sleeping there ever again peacefully. I left Butte Valley with evidence and closure. Yet something stayed with me, the knowledge that some horrors are logistical, bureaucratic, built on schedules and silence, thriving not on fear, but on indifference and exhaustion from people who assume someone else will intervene eventually, instead of them personally ever there. When I tell you this now, I am not scared of ghosts or darkness, but of systems that normalize cruelty, of places where nobody asks questions, and of carts rolling freely because everyone agrees not to notice until a reporter refuses to sleep quietly anymore after learning truths firsthand here. I stopped reporting on hotels after that, choosing stories where people survived, where villains were obvious, because the mundanity of what I saw there unsettled me more deeply than any sensational crime scene ever could, and because I needed distance from corridors and carts forever after that experience alone then. I am telling you because you asked why I flinch at hotel hallways, why I listen for wheels at night, and why I believe the scariest places are the ones still operating, still smiling, still insisting nothing is wrong long after victims have been quietly removed without ceremony ever again. I was already halfway across the lobby with my bag cutting into my shoulder when the desk clerk called my name, not loud, just certain, like he knew I would stop. I turned because that's what you do when someone says your name in a place where nobody should know it yet. He slid the ledger toward me instead of the receipt and said I had missed a line. I leaned over the counter, annoyed, tired, thinking this was just another small country inefficiency I would later joke about. And that was when I noticed the column where the checkout dates should have been was blank all the way down. I tapped the page with my pen and said there must be a mistake. He smiled without showing teeth and said, "No, it's correct. We don't fill that part in." I remember feeling a quick irritation, the kind you get when you're explaining your job to someone who doesn't want to understand it. I told him I was a budget analyst, that incomplete records create problems, and he said, very calmly, that the records were complete for their purposes. That should have been the moment I walked back out. But instead I signed my name, because I was tired and because nothing bad ever happens when you expect it to. My room key was heavier than I expected, old, fashioned, with a metal tag stamped with a number that didn't match the room number he'd said out loud. I noticed it, filed it away, and told myself I was being pedantic. Inside the room, the first thing I did was set my bag down and open my laptop, because routine keeps me grounded. I had invoices to review for a municipal audit in the morning, and I planned to be asleep in an hour. When I sat on the bed, it dipped more than it should have, as if someone had just stood up from it. I stood again immediately, heart thudding, and ran my hand across the blanket. It was still warm. I told myself that housekeeping must have just finished, but I had watched the corridor on the way in, and it had been empty. I checked the bathroom, the closet, behind the door, all the places your mind jumps to even when you know you're being irrational. The room was empty. I locked the door, slid the chair under the handle, and laughed at myself out loud, a short, brittle sound. An hour later, I realized I had forgotten my phone charger in the car. I stood there arguing with myself, then finally unlocked the door and stepped back into the corridor. That was when I heard voices coming from the office, low and rhythmic, like people reciting something together. I paused, not wanting to interrupt, and that's when I saw the ledger again through the open doorway, laid out on the counter. From where I stood, I could see names, dates, payment amounts, all neatly filled in. Just no departures. I walked closer without really deciding to. The clerk and the older man with him fell silent and watched me. I pointed at the book and asked, half joking, if nobody ever checked out. The older man said, "Some do, eventually," and then he asked if I was enjoying my stay so far. There was something in the way he emphasized the word stay that made my stomach tighten. I said I had forgotten my charger and asked for directions to the parking area. The clerk gave them, still smiling, and neither of them moved as I walked away. When I got to my car, I opened the trunk and realized my charger was right there in my bag the whole time. I stood in the gravel longer than necessary, breathing, considering my options. I could leave. I should have left. But it was late, and I was already here, and nothing concrete had actually happened. I went back inside. Sleep didn't come easily. Every small sound felt amplified. At some point, I heard footsteps outside my door, slow and deliberate, stopping right in front of it. I held my breath. A hand brushed the handle, testing it gently, then withdrew. I didn't move until morning. When I checked my watch, it was just past 6. I packed quickly and went to the desk, determined to pay and leave. The clerk looked surprised to see me, as if he hadn't expected me to still be there. I asked for my bill. He said, "Of course," and turned the ledger toward me again. My name was there, the date of arrival, the payment amount. The checkout column was still empty. I said I was leaving now. He nodded, but he didn't write anything. I asked him to. He looked at me with something like pity and said, "We'll see." That was when the fear finally crystallized into something solid. I demanded to speak to a manager. He gestured to the older man, who was suddenly standing beside me without my noticing him arrive. The older man told me, very gently, that guests who left before their accounts were settled caused discrepancies. I said my account was settled, that I had prepaid. He said money was only one part of the balance. I asked what the other part was. He didn't answer. Instead, he asked if I would be willing to review their books professionally, just to ensure everything was in order. He said they had been looking for someone with my background. I don't know why I agreed. Fear can make you cooperative in strange ways. They led me into a back room where stacks of ledgers lined the walls, decades worth. As I flipped through them, the pattern became undeniable. Names appeared once and never again. Payments continued, month after month. Small charges, maintenance fees, room services, always billed, always paid. I recognized some of the names from missing person cases I had idly read about over the years. My hands were shaking by the time I closed the last book. I asked where those people were. The older man said they were still guests. He said the motel provided stability, predictability, a life without outside complications. He said many people found it a relief. I told them I was leaving. I said I would call the police. The clerk laughed then, the first real emotion I'd seen from him, and said the nearest station was hours away and notoriously understaffed. The older man said I could leave, of course, once my stay was complete. I asked when that would be. He said, when the ledger allowed it. They put me back in my room and locked the door from the outside. I tried the window, but it opened onto a sheer drop I hadn't noticed before. I sat on the bed and forced myself to think. Systems fail, people make mistakes. Ledgers can be altered. That night, I pried open the vent and crawled into the maintenance crawl space, following it toward what I hoped was an exit. I emerged behind the office and found the main ledger unattended. My hands were steady as I wrote a checkout date beside my name, pressing hard enough to leave an imprint. I walked out without looking back. At dawn, I crossed the border. Months later, I checked the news. The motel had burned down. No bodies were found. Sometimes, I wonder if my name is still in that book, the ink slowly fading, waiting. I was still rubbing the stiffness out of my fingers when the clerk slid the clipboard toward me and said, almost casually, that they needed my fingerprints before they could give me the key. I laughed at first, thinking it was a joke or some quirky Icelandic regulation I had missed, but the clerk did not smile back. They turned the clipboard so I could see the ink, pad already waiting, dark and glossy, and my stomach tightened in a way I could not explain. I asked why, keeping my voice light even though my pulse had started to jump. The clerk said it was for guest safety, the same tone someone might use to explain a fire exit. I told them I had already shown my passport, credit card, everything. They nodded, patient, and repeated that fingerprints were required for check-in. I remember thinking how tired I was, how badly I wanted a shower and a bed, and how being questioned or singled out was something I had learned to navigate without showing fear. Still, something about the way they avoided my eyes made my skin prickle. I pressed my thumb into the ink, trying not to think about what that mark meant. The ink felt colder than it should have, tacky as it stuck to my skin. The clerk watched closely as I rolled each finger onto the paper, their gaze sharp and measuring. When I finished, they took the clipboard and tucked it under the desk, instead of placing it with the other forms. That small detail lodged itself in my mind and refused to leave. They handed me a key card without another word. I asked, half joking, if they wanted a blood sample too. The clerk smiled then, thin and quick, and said no, fingerprints were enough. I walked away feeling foolish for being uneasy, but the sensation followed me down the hallway, a steady pressure between my shoulders. Inside the room, I locked the door and stood there for a moment, listening to my own breathing. I told myself I was overreacting. I reminded myself that I had faced worse stares, worse questions, worse threats, and survived them. Still, I wiped my fingers again and again with the towel, as if I could scrub away the feeling of having given something vital without understanding why. When I lay down, sleep did not come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the ink pad, the clerk's unblinking stare. After a while, I reached for my phone and searched for the motel, expecting to find nothing unusual. Instead, I found a handful of vague complaints buried in travel forums. People mentioned invasive check-in procedures, unexplained charges, staff who asked too many questions. One comment mentioned fingerprints, dismissed by others as paranoia. I stared at that line until my eyes burned. The next morning, I went back to the desk and asked about the fingerprint policy. A different clerk was there, younger, nervous. When I mentioned fingerprints, their face went blank. They said the motel did not collect biometric data, never had. I felt the air go thin. I told them exactly what had happened, described the clerk from the night before. They shook their head and said no one matching that description worked there. I asked to see the registration forms. They hesitated, then said guest records were confidential. The refusal felt rehearsed. I pressed harder, my voice rising despite my effort to stay calm. Other guests glanced over, curious. The clerk asked me to lower my voice. That was when I realized I was shaking. Back in my room, I called the number on the motel's website. It rang and rang, then went dead. I tried again. Same result. A sense of being trapped crept in. Irrational, but strong. I packed my bag quickly, planning to leave, but when I reached the door, there was a slip of paper on the floor. No sound had alerted me to its arrival. It simply lay there, folded neatly. The note thanked me for my cooperation and reminded me that my data was valuable. My throat went dry. There was no signature. I checked the hallway. Empty. Too quiet. I locked the door again and sat on the bed, staring at the note until the words blurred. I knew then that I could not just leave. Leaving without understanding felt dangerous, like walking away from a burning smell without finding the source. I needed answers, even if they scared me. I went back online and dug deeper, changing search terms, looking beyond travel sites. That was when I found reports of missing travelers along coastal routes, scattered across years, all frustratingly vague. No suspects. No bodies. Just people who checked into small motels and never checked out. One detail repeated in several reports caught my attention: identity confusion. Passports misfiled, names misspelled. Gender markers changed. I felt a cold recognition. I thought about how often my documents had been questioned. How often systems struggled to categorize me. I realized with a sinking clarity that I was not an accident. I was a target. I took the note and went to the front desk again. The nervous clerk paled when they saw it. They whispered for me to put it away. Glancing toward the back office, I asked who had access to my fingerprints. They swallowed hard and said they could not talk about it. I told them I would go to the police. They flinched at that, actually flinched, and said the police already knew. That sentence hit me harder than a threat. I asked what they meant. The clerk leaned closer and said, in a rush, that the motel partnered with a data security firm. That fingerprints were part of a verification process. I asked, verification for what? They shook their head, eyes glossy, and said they needed this job. I left the desk and walked outside, my thoughts racing. The idea that this was sanctioned, tolerated, maybe even profitable, made my chest ache with anger and fear. I called a friend, told them where I was, what was happening. Hearing a familiar voice steadied me enough to think clearly. They urged me to leave immediately. I promised I would, but not before gathering proof. I waited until night, when the lobby emptied. I slipped back to the desk and found the back office door unlocked. Inside, files were stacked carelessly, labeled with dates. I opened one at random and froze. Inside were copies of IDs, fingerprint sheets, handwritten notes. Some names were crossed out, replaced with numbers. I flipped through, my hands trembling, and saw patterns emerge. Guests flagged for being alone, undocumented in some way, or unlikely to be quickly missed. I heard footsteps and ducked behind a cabinet. The original clerk entered, speaking on the phone. They talked about a shipment, about data transfers, about a buyer who wanted more recent samples. I felt sick. When they left, I photographed everything I could, my phone buzzing with low battery warnings. I slipped out and went straight to my car. My hands shook as I started the engine. I half expected someone to block my way, but no one did. I drove until the motel lights vanished behind me, then kept going until exhaustion forced me to stop. The next day, I went to the authorities in a larger town, showed them the photos, the note. They listened carefully, asked precise questions. For the first time since check-in, I felt believed. An investigation followed, slow and quiet. I learned later that the motel was part of a network selling biometric data to criminal groups who used it to create false identities, trap vulnerable travelers, and erase them. The motel closed. Arrests were made. Some missing people were traced, not all. I gave statements, testified, relived the fear in stark rooms with neutral walls. It took time, but the nightmares faded. Now, when I think about that night, what stays with me is not the fear of dying, but the casual way my body was treated as a resource. The ease with which a smile and a clipboard almost cost me my life. I tell you this because it was real, because it happened, and because surviving it taught me that listening to that first flicker of unease can make all the difference.